Welcome you all at the 17th Jeju Forum. My name is Song Jong-woo and I will be your MC today. Now we'll start our session, Climate Change, Socio-Political Conflict and Peace in Africa. So if you want to listen interpretation, please use your receivers. One is for Korean and channel 2 is for English. So our moderator today, in academia, he is the president of the Korean African Association, and he has served as vice president of the Korean Defense Policy Association and the Korean International Political Science Association. His major external activities include serving as a consultant to the United Nations and UNESCO, and as a self-evaluation member of government agencies such as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Defense Acquisition Program Administration, and the Ministry of Personnel. Professor Choi Dong-ju from Sookmyung Women's University. Professor, the floor is yours. Please give him a big round of applause. Thank you very much. As introduced, I am Choi Dong-ju, professor at Sookmyung Women's University. As you're well aware, climate change and sustainable development, actually they form a function. So when we think about that function, who and which continent will be the most vulnerable? You might have heard a lot about that. And when it comes to climate change, there is a change of precipitation. A rapid change of precipitation affects the outcome of the agriculture and actually affects their life, and actually it makes the fluctuation of the costs. So in the African continent, the situation is quite dire. So today, we have two presenters. Two very prominent presenters are with us. They will talk about the global security, human security, about peace, about the regional peace in Africa. They will talk on a global level, and agriculture and conflict will be also handled by our presenters, and what actually is happening and how we can handle that issue. They have prepared a prominent presentations. So I will give each presenter 20 minutes, and I will give about 10 minutes for each discussants. And after that, we will be able to take some inquiries from the floor, and our panelists and discussants will give reaction. And our first presenter today, and then our second presenter will do his presentation, and then two discussants will follow.
First presenter is working for the UN organization dealing with high-level policy, Mr. Jean-Paul Adam.
Presentation for 20 minutes.
Good morning, and it's a great pleasure for me to be able to join this Jeju Forum, even if I would have preferred to be there in person. But thank you very much for engaging with the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa on this very important subject, particularly addressing the link between climate, socioeconomic issues, security, and peace in Africa. So in my presentation, there will be two main parts. The first relates to the nature of climate-driven insecurity on the African continent. And the second part will address some of the potential actions that need to be taken to deal with this climate-driven insecurity. One of the first aspects that we can notice when we look at the security situation across the continent is there is an increasing correlation between internal displacement due to conflict and climate-related disasters. If you can look at the map, which is featured on the screen, you will see that the recorded incidents of conflict and violence are in orange, and the disasters that have been recorded in this map dates from 2021, and the disasters are in blue. And what we can see is that there is an increasing link between where disasters are occurring, the impact that this has on internal displacement, and the consequent continuation of conflicts. These findings come from the State of the Climate in Africa report 2021, led by the World Meteorological Organization with support from organizations such as my own, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. Africa has a 37% of the global total of internally displaced persons, and this is a continued pressure in relation to managing the security situation of the continent, and also dealing with the humanitarian aspects that are associated with disasters. We can see some of the examples of conflict and climate impact linkages in East Africa in two examples. Firstly, in the context of Nile water sharing negotiations between Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt, this is being exacerbated and made more difficult by climate impacts that are likely to make the water supply more erratic. And we have already seen that in the East African Horn, there have been 3 years of successive drought. Unfortunately, the drought is often also followed by flooding, leading to a cycle of displacement of vulnerable persons. We would also note that in the Arabian Peninsula in Somalia, where there have been unseasonably warm weather for the last 3 years, and this has been coupled with civil war in Yemen, but also in Somalia, where the security situation has not been stable, and this has affected the ability to take measures to deal with the locust outbreak. And this locust outbreak has spread across the whole of the Horn of Africa and even into the Sahel region, and it threatens the food security of 25 million people in the region. We can see that there is a growing risk of climate disasters as accelerators of conflict. There are a significant number of types of disasters that Africa is more likely to see. Here you will see the most likely disasters as recorded in countries' nationally determined contributions as presented to the Paris Agreement. So flooding and drought are the two most likely and most concerning natural disasters, and which also have the biggest impact in terms of displacement of persons, and also have a big impact in terms of food security, and ultimately also therefore have an impact on the likelihood of incidents of conflict and violence in the regions. We also see increases in temperature and changes in precipitation patterns being huge issues, in particular because unpredictable rainfall patterns are changing the way in which farmers, for example, can plant their crops, and also places pressure on pastoralists who are often transferring their livestock from one region to another, and this is causing sources of tension which are leading to conflict. In many countries across the continent, we're also seeing increases in sea level rises, the impact that this is having on coastal communities, and also larger and more frequent impacts of storms and cyclones and extreme weather events. We can expect that the impact of climate change will further drive insecurity going forward as the economic impact of climate change increases. Most African countries are projected to lose between 2 and 5% of GDP by 2030, but this is in very conservative estimates of below 2 degrees of warming. The reality is that we are currently on track for about 2.4 to 2.5 degrees of warming, and in African countries, this is at least 5% loss of GDP. In some regions, if you look towards the Saharan region, where some of the highest impacts are likely to be felt, there will be losses of in excess of 10% of GDP, and even as high as 15% of GDP. This is situated in a context where African countries are often already doing emergency spending of up to 9% of their budgets to respond to climate-related disasters. And what we can note is that climate change also has a bigger impact even than COVID-19, where the contractions on average in African countries were 2.7% of GDP. The impact, therefore, of climate change going forward will lead to severe socioeconomic impacts and consequently have impacts on security and the ability of governments to support their populations. The impact of climate change is also having a direct prevalence on not only on GDP, but on food security and the ability to produce food on the continent. As already mentioned, the high warming scenarios, Africa may lose up to and beyond 10% of its GDP, and in the low warming scenarios, it will be 5%. The current pathway is 2.4 degrees, based on what was agreed in Glasgow. But under this current scenario, you will see yields of key African crops that will be dropping by up to 22% by 2050. On the right side of the slide, you will see some of the main crops that are affected, and these are core African staples, including maize, which is expected to drop by 22%, millet by 17%, sorghum by 17%, cassava by 8%, and groundnut by 18%. I will now go to the second part of the presentation, which is addressing climate risks by investing in a green recovery to build security. And this is focused on looking at what are the key actions that need to be taken in terms of investment to boost the resilience of African countries and also reduce the risk of conflict as a consequence. So firstly, one of the main challenges for the continent is energy access. And in the map on the left, you can see how the vast majority of people who do not have access to electricity around the world, in fact, 3/4 of the global population without access to electricity, are found in Africa. And that's 570 million people. And in some countries, if you look particularly towards the Central African region, the access to reliable electricity may be as low as 10%. This is coupled with a situation where 82% of the population of sub-Saharan Africa, that's 860 million people, do not have access to clean cooking solutions. This means that they are dependent on firewood for cooking in most instances, and this has a detrimental effect in terms of not only their ability to provide secure heating and cooking for their families, but also in terms of the natural environment, where the demand for cooking fuel, so for example for trees, drives deforestation, which has a further impact on security issues, including clashes relating to the use of land and the use of livestock on that land. It should be noted that this energy access challenge can also be framed as an opportunity, because Africa will need to double its present electricity generation by 2030 and multiply it by 5 by 2050. Meaning that we have to go from, we have to increase to 250 gigawatts by 2030 and by 1,250 gigawatts by 2050. Now, to achieve the 2030 target is an investment of $500 billion US. This is a huge amount of money. It is also sometimes seen as a challenge, because how do we raise this amount of money? I think we need to look at it in the context of the opportunity that this presents for investment, because even if the return on investment might in some cases be long-term, the return on investment is very good, and we'll see this a little bit later in terms of the rates of return on investment. And also in Africa, the rate of default on energy projects is extremely low. It is around 5%, and this compares favorably with a number of other regions. Even if Africa may be seen as risky, in terms of the return on investment in energy projects, it is a very secure investment. A second element of being able to reduce the risk of insecurity in the longer term and creating sustainable investments will be investing in sustainable value chains. And one of the areas that the UNECA has been looking at in particular is multi-country investment strategies, which are depending on the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. We are very much aware that African countries in the past have tended to depend on the export of raw materials with minimal value addition. The investment in value chains where there is more value addition and therefore linking to more retained income in African countries and more retained jobs is the key element. There are increased demand for green minerals across the world, and green minerals are often minerals such as cobalt, lithium, and so on. This increased demand was already set to grow by 500% by 2050, according to the World Bank, and the battery demand is also growing 25% annually. This greater demand, particularly for cobalt, almost 70% of the world's supply, 68% to be specific, are found within the DRC. And the Democratic Republic of Congo and Zambia combine to 11% of the world copper supply, which is also a critical part of the green minerals value chain. So the mining sector also already contributes significantly to African countries. So there is a very positive opportunity to invest further in these sectors based on the increased demand for battery technologies. But we have to make sure that we address the limited employment multipliers as is currently. Increasing the value addition opportunity will lead to more employment and will therefore contribute even further towards the government revenues in African countries and the reduced risk, therefore, of insecurity. The Democratic Republic of Congo, in particular, is often referred to as one of the most insecure regions of the world. And being able to invest in sustainable value chains that cover not only the DRC but other countries and create employment and government revenues will be a key element of reducing the challenges of insecurity across the continent. Another area which is of interest and of emerging importance for African countries is what we term the blue economy. And this is about sustainably investing in both the protection and economic development of the oceanic spaces. The African Union had adopted in 2020 a blue economy strategy, and the opportunity for developing a blue economy is emphasized within that strategy. On the right of the slide, you will see the exclusive economic areas of some of the largest exclusive economic areas that are available to African countries. South Africa notably having a exclusive economic area which is 1.5 million square kilometers. And even smaller countries such as Seychelles have a exclusive economic area of in excess of 1 million square kilometers. Tapping into these large exclusive economic areas is key to be able to develop sustainable value chains, for example, around fisheries, increasing the opportunity for more value addition, but also being able to look at alternative types of economic activity that can be associated with the ocean, including the development of pharmaceutical products, for example, using ocean-based resources, the development of aquaculture, and being able to develop as well marine-based ecotourism. On the left part of the slide, you will see the desirable blue economy framework as expressed in the African Union Blue Economy Strategy. And Blue Economy Framework is framed around environmental sustainability, social sustainability, and economic sustainability, is addressing issues that are associated with global dynamics, ensures that there are international and regional governance frameworks, in particular, that allows the sustainable access to oceanic resources, that there are strong national governance frameworks, and that blue economy sectors, both traditional and emerging, are supported in a way which we can use the ocean as a new development space. Another aspect that we have to address to reduce the risks of insecurity going forward is the ability to respond quickly when natural disasters happen. And one of the biggest challenges for African countries is the ability to fund a response to natural disasters in a timely fashion. A lot of the debate around loss and damage in the climate negotiations has been around providing the funds to African countries so that they can respond very quickly. The Africa Group of Negotiators has identified some key principles for an effective approach to addressing loss and damage. And they have emphasized that any framework or structure that is put in place to address loss and damage must be just, transparent, predictable, accessible, equitable, owned by African countries, and particularly those who are impacted by extreme weather events, that the resources must be additional to existing climate finance, and that the resources must also be fit for purpose, meaning that they must address the scale of loss and damage incurred by climate change. This will be particularly important because the frequency of extreme weather events is increasing. We are seeing that particularly around cyclones that originate in the Indian Ocean region and which are having significant impact on Eastern and Southern Africa in recent years. So moving towards the final two slides of the presentation, the Economic Commission for Africa undertook studies to compare the opportunity for investing in green sectors relative to fossil fuel reliant sectors. And our green recovery case studies showed a very strong return on investment in terms of the investment in green sectors, particularly positive relative to fossil fuel sectors. In fact, the highest return on investment were achieved investing in green sectors. And we can see in the graphs, so for example, in the electric vehicle infrastructure sector for Egypt, first bar of the graph, the return on investment was in excess of 400%. In terms of renewable energy investment in Kenya through biogas plants, which is the second bar, the return on investment is 280%. In Egypt, investment in a biogas plant, return on investment is 400%. In South Africa, investment in electric vehicle infrastructure has a return of almost 300%, while in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the return on investment by investing in utility-grade solar is 180%. So this is an indication of the return on investment in the energy sector, which, as we have already indicated, in terms of the access issue in particular, is one of the areas of focus to be able to achieve resilience. But what we also saw is that an extremely high return of investment when looking at agriculture and sustainable water usage, and also natural capital investments. Natural capital investments may involve restoration of environments or also the creation of national parks, or of the investment in agroforestry in a way which preserves the resource. So the green recovery case studies also showed a very strong return on investment again in these sectors. So firstly, in Egypt, the investment in reverse osmosis irrigation for agriculture, basically improving the water usage using solar energy for agriculture in Egypt, achieved a return on investment of almost 500%. While in Kenya, investment in resilient seeds, which are more resistant to climate impacts, delivers a return on investment of almost 300%. In the DRC, the investment in agroforestry brings a return on investment of around 170%, while in South Africa, investment in mangrove restoration, which is also very important for fish reproduction in coastal areas, brings a return on investment of 150%, while investment in irrigation in the Democratic Republic of Congo brings a return of investment of 500%. So in conclusion, the climate change is going to drive increasing risks for the African continent. It is going to affect critical issues such as food security, and this has a huge impact on internal displacements and therefore the continued stress of conflict and risks of conflict associated with increased migration across regions and the need for pastoralists to bring their livestock further afield. All of these pressures will create a direct link between the rising impact of climate change and the continued risk of insecurity. But these risks can all be mitigated through urgent investment in key sectors, and in particular sectors that boost resilience, starting with energy, but also looking at areas that help develop sustainable value chains across the continent, and therefore boosting employment opportunities and simultaneously reducing the risks to climate impacts. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward very much to the discussion and questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Director Adam. Correspondence, data, friend, and it's almost like an inventory list. And it was interesting to discuss new features to discuss climate change. Thank you very much for your detailed presentation.
경제연구기관이죠.
Next presenter is from Kiev, Representative Institute of Korea, and Mr. Kang Moon-soo will talk about the climate change impact in Africa, much more focused on agriculture and conflict. So when you talk about conflict related to cultural change, the biggest one was related to water resource. And we're seeing a new trend. It used to be a cross-bordering river, and the conflict was rather national. But recently, for these conflicts, we have some good institutional settings. And the local conflicts started to rise. It started nonviolence, but we are now seeing lots and lots of violence conflicts. So when there's an election, the conflicts tends to go higher, and politicization tends to be made. So it is a new feature, and it is quite dire. So Mr. Kang has been running a lot of research on these issues. Please give him a big round of applause. You have 18 minutes. Thank you.
네, 감사합니다.
Thank you very much. As introduced, my name is Kang Moon-soo, and I'm from the Korea Institute for International Economic Policy. And Mr. Adam just mentioned what is implied, but I will focus on what we can see. So I quote this from IPCC report. So the global temperature has increased about 1 degree compared to pre-industrialization, and that can make the Africa have a dire situation for food security. And the price is going up, and it actually accelerates the outflow of refugees. So this is a report from my last year research. I wanted to examine the trends of climate change in sub-Saharan Africa and analyze the effects of climate change and examine the effects of climate change on regional conflicts. So when we center the Africa, we have 3 major traits. So the first thing is declining agricultural productivity, the food prices will rise, and the proportion of population in hunger will also rise. Second trait, the collapse of production base, and there will be a migration of local people, and there will be a conflict between migrants and indigenous people. The third trait is there is a decrease in pastures, and the nomads will travel further distances, and of course there will be conflict between nomads and farmers. So there were some prior researchers to look upon these trends, and the overall productivity of corn, millet, sorghum, and peanut is expected to decrease as the temperature rises. And when there's a temperature rise and there's a decrease in precipitation or precipitation variability increases, the probability of dispute tend to increase. And when we look at the data from other researchers, so because there is fewer food production, and then it's a kind of backward research. Since Africa is very wide, so conflicts can go both ways, for example in Burundi. So this is summary of my results. So temperature rise rather than precipitation is affecting crop productivity. And in case of corn, maize is the main crop in African countries. The overall productivity of maize is predicted to decrease. And when there's a rise in temperature, the civil disputes have an inverted U-shaped relationship. So, which means that there's a threshold, and when the temperature exceeds that threshold, it starts to decrease. And when it comes to conflicts, such as armed fightings, it has a U-shaped relationship with temperature. So when a certain critical point is crossed, the occurrence becomes more frequent. So I know my time is very short, so I'll go very quick. So from the data, since 1950, the average annual temperature in Africa from 2000 to 2017 has become from less than 24 to more than 25 degrees. So by region, you can see that the temperature rise is about 1 degree Celsius. And in the red, in South Sudan, in Central Africa, in Malawi, you see that the temperature rise is more than 2 degrees. In west southern regions like Angola shows more than 1.5 degree. So in West Africa, the annual temperature is already very high, about 27 degrees. So if you have the same temperature rise, the West Africa, the agriculturers are harder stuck. So this is the precipitation. The difference is increasing and the precipitation is generally decreasing. So you have the West Africa, East Africa, and all in all, you can see a decrease here. And when you see the annual precipitation, the year-on-year change is very high. So a more agricultural country, then it is very difficult to forecast the agricultural times. And this is the annual precipitation changes. Variability is higher in East Africa. And the drought is very dire there, so we expect that there will be a food crisis. So that is our expectation right now. In Eastern Africa, the variability is very high. So if there's two cultivation in a year, these cases where we cannot predict is becoming a larger issue. So again, in Eastern Africa, the issue is much direr. And in the right figure, the variability is monthly precipitation is lower compared to the 1900s. And these these are the areas with a heat wave and drought trends. Again, the droughts are mainly tend to increase. And when we talk about the entire Africa, the number of heat wave and droughts are increasing in total. So I ran this analysis. So we did this analysis in 4 crops: maize, rice, sorghum, and millet. This is how we did that. So this is the maize. So if there's a 1 temperature rise, the crop outcome will show a 10% decrease, and if there's a 3-degree increase, then the production will go 40% lower. So actually, this is a country data, so by area, when the change will be direr. Sorghum also is going low, and rice actually is more heat resistant compared to other crops. So for example, the maize production will drop in when the temperature is 22 degrees, but for rice, the decrease will show only after the temperature goes more than 27 degrees. So actually, this is a scenario from past data. And here you can see actually the production of rice will go up. But if we run a forecast of the future, we believe that the production of rice will also go down at a certain point. For maize, for corn, I mentioned that this is a major crop in many countries, so the decrease of production of maize can be a very big problem in Sahara countries. The import is not much high compared to a local production, so if maize is, if there is an impact on maize, then again there will be a crisis in the future. Again, the price of maize will go up. This is one of our forecasts. Then the price will go up and the production will decrease. Then the purchasing power again will go down. In East Africa and West Africa will be more impacted. And East African countries, for East African countries, corn is their main crop, so there will be impacted harder. So for example, countries like Ghana, if the production goes lower, then the corn consumptions will be also impacted. And the second thing, what impact has this in conflicts? So actually we ran this analysis model. I looked upon many prior analysis, but actually they say that there is a lot of social related issues, for example, the population or anything like that. So I wanted to exclude everything and I wanted to focus on climate change. So these are the types of conflicts. So from the prior researchers, they actually seen conflict as a whole, but the type of conflict is also important. So whether it can be government-led or private-led, there can be riots, there can be rallies. Actually, that comes from a private background. So actually, these are quite different types of conflicts. So there can be engagement, armed conflict, attacks on civilians. These conflicts we cannot see these days, and demonstration were actually increased a lot. For example, protests because of high energy prices. We see these kind of protests more and more. So I wanted to classify the types of the conflicts. Here you can see all the types here from 1997 to 2020. So this is an accumulate point of view. So it is not very easy to figure out what's happening where. But if you look at the table at your left, East Africa has almost 40% of share. And if you see country by country, there are 4 major countries with a lot of conflicts in sub-Saharan areas: Somalia, Nigeria, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Republic of South Africa. So the types differ a lot. But one thing that comes in common is that, again, this data is until 2020, but in the early 2020, when the COVID-19 break out, the increase was very high. But even before that, the number of conflicts in Somalia and sub-Saharan areas, they were tending. So I wanted to figure out whether it is really from the climate change. So these are the years with major climate change, when there were droughts. For example, Niger, it's about 46%, Mauritania 46%, Eritrea about 43%, which means that when the food is scarce or there's a drought, the conflicts tend to go higher. And when there's a flood, so it is, we have to see more than just precipitation, so it is kind of a systemic issue. So many of the African countries does not have systems to prevent flood, so when the precipitation goes high, the chance of flood actually also goes high. So from the years with floods, for example, Sudan, about 65% of the conflicts happened in years with flood. Malawi, Guinea, Namibia, Democratic Congo, Cameroon, Senegal. More than 50% of the conflicts happened in the years with flood. So what we can imply here that climate change is happening long term, but the droughts and flood is more concentrated and it's more short-term when it's a dire climate change. And in these years, the number of conflicts tends to go high in these African countries. So we can tell that actually climate change affects the number of conflicts. Then the second thing I wanted to figure out was, from the slide before, now, there's a conflict between farmer and pastoralists. So I looked upon Sudan and Nigeria. Sudan, we had this Darfur conflict, and Nigeria, there was an issue related to Chad Lake, as the Chad Lake shrinks year after year. So the pastoralists are having a dire situation there. So the conflict between farmers and pastoralists, if there's a dispute between the boundaries, recently Sudan and Nigeria is seeing more and more conflicts related to this issue. And when we look at the number, after 2010, the increase was very high. So when there's a precipitation change, there might be a drought, and when it goes long term, then the chance of conflicts goes high. Again, this is the result from my analysis, quantitative analysis. So civilian-led disputes, such as protests and riots, for example, 22 degrees for protests, about 27.5 degrees for riots, there's an inverse U-shaped relationship that tends to increase, then decrease after the critical point. So on the other hand, engagement and civilian attacks, for example, 24 degrees, they decrease until that temperature, and then after that they start to increase. So for the civilian-led disputes, so people, when temperature goes higher, then the agricultural life gets harder, and then the civilians might go into that area, go to another area, they would be moving. So I believe maybe that is the reason for the decrease. And the engagement and civilian attacks. As the temperature goes high, then the conflicts goes larger. For example, country to country, then it might lead to a genocide or other country to country conflict. So again, these conflict among countries might rise again if the temperature continues to go up. The precipitation effect is less significant. So I believe it is more related to flood from precipitation, and if there isn't damage in the economy, then the conflict might go up. So when you look at more long term, the number of conflicts is going down. So from a long-term point of view, this is the result, and demonstration tends to go up. So from prior results, we can see that there's a prolonged drought, and that is not the main reason of a riot or demonstration, because the agricultural, the civilians, actually, there is a threshold, and if the temperature goes up that threshold, then the number of conflicts goes high. So in a more long-term point of view, the chance of these conflicts will go higher. So implications, as we could see in previous studies, the rise in average temperature actually increase the probability of conflict. But conflict among countries, actually it's a little bit different. And when it comes to a long-term perspective, droughts and climate change as high temperature have more effects on the number of these conflicts. And floods rather than droughts have more impacts on these kind of conflicts. And my conclusion here, maize and other major agricultural products are showing prominent productivity declines, and they tend to go down in long term. But there were some major conflicts, for example, Sudan and Nigeria, because of the temperature change. But we will have to see closer on precipitation and other climate situations. We might think that it can be expanded to other countries as well. So the World Bank is expecting there will be about 78 million migrants from East and West Africa, and it is highly likely that conflicts will become more frequent as the climate deteriorates. So the international community's efforts is needed. So we have to do things like breed improvements, conflict prevention, and other things as well. That concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you, Mr. Kang. Actually, you showed us many models, analysis models, and exact data, and its results as well. Thank you very much for the detailed presentation.
Now I would like to invite Professor Cho Won-bin from Sungkyunkwan University to listen to his insights and the feedback after the two presentations. Professor Cho Won-bin is a vice chairman of Korea African Foundation, and Michigan State University was his alma mater. Hi, my name is Cho Won-bin. As introduced, Director Adam, thank you very much for your presentation. I learned a lot from your presentation. In particular, in Africa, there have been some conflicts that are lingered to climate change, and it was an interesting topic to hear the correlation between the civil conflicts and the climate change and some natural disasters. But despite the difficulties that Africa faces, but it was interesting to listen to blue economy. I've heard of green economy, but it was my very first time to listen to blue economy, and it was an interesting concept introduced by African Union. Renewable energy and other green-related industries can draw more investment because they have a high return of investment, as you explained. So, despite all the difficulties, Africa can go beyond civil conflicts by realizing blue economies. So centered around the African Union, probably the Africa can efficiently tackle climate change in the course of realizing blue economy. So that was interesting. That to me it was more like suggesting a solution for the African continent, and it has a lot of details. Thank you again for your presentation. I'm not sure Director Adam heard of Jeju Island.
그러지 않을 것이라고 생각하는.
I'm not sure, and I'm not sure whether Director Adam has been to Korea, but Jeju is such a beautiful island in Korea, and however, Jeju is not sensitive to this climate change issue because Jeju is just well-known, eco-friendly island with beautiful scenery, and I don't know how much we can imminently feel about the conflicts that Africa has. The area in Jeju called Hanlim has a windmill, and they not only provide electricity but work with dive ladies called Haenyeo, but they do have some conflicts with some local dive ladies. Also, regarding establishing the solar facilities, the government, the local government actually has some conflicts with the locals. I'm sure it is not as severe as the conflicts that the Africa faces, but still, in this little island, in the course of realizing the carbon neutrality, and carbon neutrality is common goal for everyone, we still have some small conflicts in the region here and there. A lot of Koreans are not really familiar with Africa, but as Director Adam introduced, if you looked at the map of Africa, violence and conflicts overlapped where there are some natural disasters on his first slide, and it has a high correlation. And where there are higher violence and conflicts, mostly centered around East Africa. Richer place centered around the south, but East Africa is also the place that are emerging. So in brief, East Africa used to have these people who move from place to place, and they need to raise livestock for survival. But then when they move around places, there are some farmers who had conflicts against those newcomers, and that is a sensitive issue between these two groups. So you can imagine any conflicts among any groups in anywhere in the world which can deteriorate some economic systems, and that's how you bear terrorists even.
아프리카에서는 그런 종교 갈등이라든가 테러리스트 무브먼트들이 비무함이 발생하는구나. 우리가 뉴스에서 접하긴 하지만
And we often hear news from
효과인 것입니다.
Africa, and I just realized that they are also highly related to natural disasters and climate change. Somalia and other East Asia African countries like Kenya go through drought.
나일이 자체가 권력이 되고 그래서 지금 나일강 그 상류에 있는 에티오피아에서 큰 댐을 만들어서 물을 통제하려고 하니까
There are
이집트가 되게 크게 반발을 하는 거죠.
some conflicts over building a dam.
이런 걸 가지고 이제 권력을
So
하는 게 아니고 국가가
irrigation and water usage could become also a power that people try to fight against and over. As you are well aware, one of the biggest factors of a climate change is a carbon emission. But in Africa, I am sure it's only maybe like 2% that they contribute to carbon emission. However, the impact Africa has is enormous. So Africa seems far from Korea. However, the carbon emission we have here in Korea could influence on Africa. I think that's the lesson we can take from the presenter, from Director Adam. And I want to ask Adam.
The good cases, you introduce some cases to have productive products by the investment. So those, at the AU, African Union actually really interested in the investment from around the world to focusing on those green sector. Do you think right now, the case studies, actually those investment from the outside the continent, or the African country actually raised their fund and make the investment for those case studies? I just wondering. Okay, thank you for your presentation.
Okay, Director Adam, would you react later, right? After the one more, discussion, okay?
Okay, so I'll come in afterward.
All right, thank you. Take a memo then. All right. 그러면 우리 김은경
Our next discussant, Professor Kim Eun-kyung, she will mention about Mr. Kang's presentation. Mr. Kim Eun-kyung graduated from UCLA, their African Studies. She's now a director of Korean African Studies, and she is also teaching at the Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Professor Kim, please. As introduced, I am Kim Eun-kyung from Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Dr. Kang, thank you very much for your detailed presentation. That was quite hard but important, I believe. So this research talks about the implication of climate change on agriculture and conflict. So there are, I believe, two main points, and you analyze many data.
그 데이터에
And you use data related to climate change, agriculture, and you showed us some newest data. And you showed us some prediction and trends, and there were a lot of graphs, a lot of visualization, and you also showed us various models. So when we talk about the impact of climate change, it is not easy as it sounds, because we don't know how climate change can affect which part, and analyzing it would be a very complex analysis. But what Dr. Kang has showed us, you highlighted some interesting results for us. So when I look at the results here, that actually the interpretation seems very important. And the causality analysis also seems very important here. So we have to think about whether it is the real cause, and is so this causal mechanism can use in the future some qualitative analysis. So then we will be able to know more. So actually, I saw your slides, and actually you gave some of the answers to my questions. Still, I have some points to make.
얘기하고 또 질문도
I will mention that. So first, the agricultural productivity.
아프리카와 동아
So when we look at the West and East Africa, the maize productivity decreased significantly, but increased in South Africa. My question is, so East Africa showed a productivity decrease, and the average temperature is not high, and the weather is quite good there. But when does that productivity difference come from? So that is one question. And related to that, so about the interpretation of result and zoning, I was actually wondering how the zoning was done. Was it done following the climate situations, or was it some diplomatic implications from local communities? How was the zoning done? So, because then we talked about the East, West, and South Africa. So I was wondering how the zoning of these countries was done. And the climate change on conflict, you categorized some riots, demonstration by civilians, and another one like military attacks. So I believe that is very relevant. And you concluded why you made these categorization, and the interpretation why riots and demonstration are categorized to one thing, and why attacks on civilians are another thing. So maybe some more interpretation would help there. So again, you mentioned that temperature rise would actually lower the number of occurrence of the demonstration. So right now the temperature is constantly going up. So do you think that type of conflict will actually go down and go away? So maybe in some zones. So in the zones with a lower temperature, then these kind of demonstration might appear. And if the temperature continue to rise, then civilian attacks might also go on, related to that. So maybe you can talk more on that. And again, you talked about precipitation has less impact. So if we connect that to productivity, agricultural productivity, so if precipitation does not impact the number of conflicts, then the precipitation is not directly related to agricultural productivity. So if so, then agricultural productivity is not directly connected to the number of conflicts. I don't think so, because it's food related. So maybe the rise of sea level is the issue. Maybe people losing their territories and they are displaced. Maybe that is the reason for that, for the current conflicts. Maybe we need some clarification on that, or maybe some more explanation. So there are a lot of factors here, and there are many analysis results. So maybe we need some more context. So maybe you can tell we have these kinds of interpretation and these are related in that way. And zone, when we look at zone by zone, South Africa shows more increase in conflicts. But South Africa has a lower annual temperature and the productivity is still rising. But the number of conflict is still going up, so that might be interesting to look at. So that was an abundant zone, and so they are losing this abundance, and that maybe that was the reason why the number of conflicts is going up. Or the zone with originally low productivity might have more conflict. So that is another thing I wonder. And division of 4 regions, I mentioned that. And again, you didn't mention the social issues, but maybe the division of those 4 regions might have some internal social issues as well. So again, this is a question of zoning. You already posed so many questions. Yes, because it was very rich in content, and it was very hard for me to point out everything. And again, when we talk about Africa, there has been a lot of colonialization, and after these times there were many conflicts, and actually the temperature is going up, and we have to think about how much impact they are doing that. So when we talk about conflicts, do they come from climate changes? And you mentioned Sudan again, and other zones, maybe the number of conflicts going up comes from the climate change. My final point, the inflation. So the prices are going up, even in Korea. So this is a point of interest. So you excluded all social factors, but maybe this price rise can be reasons for conflicts. So maybe you can elaborate further on that.
네, 고맙습니다. 우리 김은경 교수님.
Thank you. Professor Kim used to be my student, so I was hoping that she could save time, but she actually spent way more time. I want to collect all the questions before listening to all the presenters, so anybody has a question from the floor, it's a good time to ask. You can ask a question to presenters or to the panel discussants. Anybody has a question, please raise your hand so we can hand over a microphone for you.
없으시면은
If not,
all right.
Thank you.
Would you identify who you are first?
Sure.
All right.
I'm Yasmin Dalila Amriswet, the ambassador of Rwanda in Korea. Well, Professor Kim asked many of my questions. I just had one specific because you touched on the eastern part of Africa, and I just wanted to know, she asked about the zoning, but I wanted a bit clarification on the zone you consider is African. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Ambassador. All right. 그러면 지금부터
now we would like to hear from the presenters as we can't see any other questions from the floor. So probably each presenter can spend 3 minutes to answer those questions.
given 3 minutes to react against the questions and comments raised by the discussant. Would you start?
Thank you. Thank you very much. And we really appreciated the engagement and the various comments and questions. I think that the issue of climate and security in Africa is interlinked in the same way that development cannot be divorced from the investment in climate resilience. More and more, we will not be able to address the priorities of African countries around development unless we are also dealing with climate in the same instance. And I think this is particularly true for the issues, for example, around investment in food security as a means of reducing the risk of conflict going forward. That also is very critical in the context of water management, both in terms of potential conflicts among countries, but also within societies, within those countries, unless we can facilitate those issues of water management, which include better practices for example, to reduce the risk of climate change and reducing water. This includes actions such as Ethiopia's Green Legacy program, which has been a large-scale planting of trees, which includes planting of trees around water areas to reduce siltation, but also to reduce other risks, including those of flooding and of disaster risks from water that can have some of these kind of impacts on the environment. The blue economy aspects are very important for Africa because the capacity of African countries has often been limited with regards to its ocean. There's been a tendency for African countries to see their borders ending at the beach, and this has meant that a lot of the industrial fisheries capacity, for example, around the continent is actually by distant fishing nations, and there is perhaps less benefit being derived by African countries themselves. So the blue economy approach is about building capacity around fisheries value chains, but it's also about better management of the economic space in oceans. So for example, also looking at marine protected areas, the role that marine protected areas play in ensuring fish stocks for the future, but also that they can be very important sources of revenue through marine ecotourism, and we're seeing that in countries such as Tanzania, Mozambique, and my own country, Seychelles, that have done this for quite a number of years. And in terms of the impacts of emissions from other parts of the world on Africa, I mean, this is very dramatic, and we heard in the other presentation how the temperature impact based on the IPCC report in Africa is being more severely felt. And hence the urgency of being able to address these issues in a context also where African countries are expected to be increasing their emissions going forward because the population has risen. We need to connect those populations to energy grids, and we have to make sure that there is the right match of technology to be able to reduce that potential future impact. And then the point about investment into Africa, in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, African countries have been severely affected by their ability to raise finance themselves. And we have seen that again, in terms of the mobilization of finance globally, the developed countries, particularly OECD countries, the amount of financing is equated to around $10,000 per capita. In low-income countries, the majority of which are African, the mobilization of resources was only $57 per capita. So there is a huge difference in the amount of resources that have been available. In terms of investment that is required, Africa has to look outside for investment to be channeled into these key sectors such as energy. There has been significant effort to structure a lot of these investments to make them more attractive for external investment, but also to structure those investments so that they do contribute to the development of internal value chains and value chains that develop trade across the African continent. And I have never been to Jeju Island. It would be a pleasure to do so in the future, but I think it does demonstrate a very interesting model of climate resilience. I have been to Korea a few times, mostly to Seoul, but I look forward to a next visit where perhaps I can come to Jeju. Thank you very much. 감사합니다.
Thank you so much.
네, 감사합니다. Dr. Kang, please go on. So, Professor Kim, thank you very much for all your questions. You don't have to remember everything. And Honorable Ambassador, yes, you also mentioned about zoning. So, zoning, we actually follow the African countries' data. So they actually define which part is South Africa, which part is East Africa. So one thing I worried, because there are like 48 countries in Africa, so getting up the mean value of all these countries does not seem quite right. So I just thought that it is too hard to look at country per country. So East Africa, so we have Burundi, Ethiopia, and many countries are classified as East Africa, but so it's not easy. For example, in Somalia, a conflict is broken out, and it goes beyond the border. So we can tell this is a part of East Africa, but it does not signify the entire East African zone. So actually, yes, I had a very hard time to interpret these results, but in the future, I believe I will narrow down all these data country by country. And the temperature rise relation to agricultural productivity, it was a scenario analysis. So it was a forecast model based on past data. So for South Africa, the data comes from the times where the average temperature is in the low 20s. So which means the maize productivity would be less impacted compared to other zones, and there is a certain threshold for maize production. And for example, the Southern African region did not reach that threshold. But again, yes, this comes from past data, and if we think about the future when there is a constant temperature rise, then the results can be much more different. And you also mentioned the types of conflict, and yes, I agree with you, and I had a very hard time interpreting all these types of conflicts, because all the types of conflict differs from zone to zone. So I actually had to think a lot, and actually the result today comes from my thoughts, and again, I have to look country by country in the future. And typing of the conflicts, why I did like that, is comes from data published by ACLED. So they do this comparison whether it's private-led, whether it's public-led, and whether the conflict is one-sided or it's double-sided. So demonstration is one side, and one thing is violence-induced and one other is not. So whether it's private-led or whether it's government-led, it's also the difference. When the government led the conflict, and if the government targeted civilians, it's attacked on civilians, and if a government is confronting other government, so if there are arms related, then it should be classified as war. So this is how I did the classification, the 4 types of conflicts. And one more thing about the inflation. You mentioned the inflation. And yes, we have food inflation and energy inflation, and they cause conflicts, and in the future I will closely look upon them. Thank you very much. Actually, we're really out of time. And the question that Madam Ambassador posed us, so I believe the typology of conflicts is very important, and duration of conflicts, whether it's protracted or not, is also another important thing as well. Second, the cross-cutting issue is STI, UN agenda. The UNDP also mentions this, the reserve duration, and related to precipitation, and related to water supply. And all in all, we had 4 prominent discussants and presenters. Thank you again for your good presentation. When it comes to Africa, we all know that 80% of the border was forced about 100 years ago. And this colonial legacy is still there, and that is the main cause of the conflict. And again, we have a lot of cross-border rivers, the source of the conflict. Then and now, the climate change is provoking this conflict further. Again, we have to look upon the history, and more than that, the Africa's high growth rate is something we're seeing. So the entire continent showed a high growth rate, and disparity is also going up. And climate change is provoking that further, so there are a lot of worries going on right now. And now I will wrap up this session. Again, I want to thank the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Korean Association of African Studies. Thank you again for hosting this session. And I want to also thank Director Adam for joining us. This concludes our session, hosted by Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Korean Association of African Studies. Our session ends here. Thank you very much. Thank you again for all the panelists, all the discussants, and all the participants. Thank you very much. I want to thank all the participants with us today, and this concludes the session of Climate Change, Socio-Political Conflict, and Peace in Africa session. We will have a short break, and at 5:10, today's last session will continue here. I urge you for more interest, and please give everyone a big round of applause. Thank you very much. Thank you.